Look at a map of Russia in 2025, and you'll see a country that seems endless, stretching across 11 time zones. But here's the strange part. The eastern half, covering more than 3/4 of the territory, is almost empty. About 25% of Russia's people live east of the Urals, despite that area holding roughly 77% of the land, and that share keeps shrinking year after year. Why is it that so much land, packed with natural wealth, remains nearly deserted? It isn't only the freezing winters that drive people away. As we'll see, the deeper causes lie in politics, infrastructure, demography, and the weight of history, factors that have left the eastern half of Russia looking very different from the west. The split nation. When we talk about a split nation, we're not just describing contrasts in lifestyle or climate. The divide is etched directly into Russia's geography. The Ural Mountains, running from the Arctic Ocean down to the Caspian Sea, serve as the central dividing line. West of them is the country most people picture: Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, densely connected cities at the core of political and economic power. East of them stretches Siberia and the Russian Far East, lands that cover over 3/4 of Russian territory but hold only about 1/4 of its people. And to make matters more complicated, by 2024-2025, the government itself began censoring demographic data, halting the routine release of monthly regional birth and death statistics. This makes it harder than ever to measure exactly how quickly the East is thinning out. The numbers that are public still reveal a stark imbalance. Nationwide, Russia's population has been shrinking from natural causes, with deaths outnumbering births by around 600,000 in 2024 alone. But the losses hit unevenly. Western urban centers continue to offset decline through internal migration inflows and foreign labor, while the East has seen only outflow. The Far Eastern Federal District has lost around 20% of its population since 1991, while the Siberian District is down by about 10% since the late Soviet census years. These long, steady declines are compounded by the lack of new arrivals. For those who do stay, it means small towns disappearing from the map and surviving regional capitals struggling to fund hospitals or maintain schools. Each additional wave of westward migration leaves fewer people behind to sustain core services. Life east of the Urals accentuates why this outmigration becomes self-reinforcing. Settlements sit far apart, often joined by a single rail line or one road vulnerable to closure in winter. Reaching higher education or specialized medical care can mean journeys of several hours or even days. For families weighing their options, the choice between an isolated town in Yakutia and an expanding suburb of Moscow is not difficult. Businesses make similar calculations, transporting goods or machinery across thousands of kilometers of taiga and tundra drives costs high and reliability low. Over time, the economic and social incentives tilt ever further in favor of the West. It's important to recognize that this geographic imbalance did not emerge naturally. The roots trace back centuries to imperial decisions about how to treat Siberia. In the era of the Tsars, conquering eastward meant acquiring vast fur reserves and later timber and minerals. These resources flowed westward into the imperial heartland. The people of Siberia, indigenous groups as well as Russian settlers, saw little reinvestment. When the Soviet Union took shape, the same logic persisted but scaled up. Siberia became the site of massive industrial camps, mining operations, and forced relocations. Millions were sent east not by choice, but as directed labor. When that system dissolved in the 1990s, so did many of the artificial communities it had sustained. Without the central command ordering factories to operate or workers to live in hostile terrain, many had no reason to stay. By the early 21st century, these historical preferences had crystallized into present-day population realities. The state had fostered an extractive relationship, Siberia as a quarry and security buffer, the West as the place where gains were collected. That imbalance means population only holds as long as there are strong incentives, usually state-driven. Once those weaken, the trend reverts back to shrinkage. This helps explain why comparing Western hubs like Moscow, still thick with construction cranes and workers, with Siberian towns abandoned to rust feels like comparing two different countries altogether. The cycle grows harsher with every round. As people leave, services contract. A town might lose its only hospital wing, or its last school might close. Residents then face longer travel distances for the basics. That pushes the next wave to leave, eroding both community life and economic viability. It's a slow churn, but by 2025, this cycle has entrenched itself across much of the Far East and Central Siberia. Once a settlement drops below a critical threshold of people, it rarely recovers because both labor and the tax base have disappeared. In this way, maps that look vast when colored by territory amount to sparsely inhabited zones when colored by live humans. And still, Siberia is too large and too critical to Russia to ignore. Its forests, oil fields, gas reserves, and mineral deposits place it among the most resource-rich regions on Earth. Yet the very scale that draws attention underlines the paradox. An area can be rich on paper while steadily emptying of people. Census data, even the partial information still available, confirms that the East is losing workers while exporting the value of its land to the West or abroad. State programs have repeatedly promised to reverse the trend, but the incentives never outweigh the disadvantages as experienced by families and businesses day to day. This is the essence of the split nation, a country whose map covers 11 time zones, but whose lifeblood, its population, clusters tightly into the European end. The apparent size papers over an uneven distribution that history and policy have entrenched. If demographic decline continues unchecked, the divide will only widen. Siberia illustrates how national power can exist side by side with regional abandonment. The imbalance makes Russia look stronger geopolitically than it feels socially on the ground. And the question grows sharper when you compare empty territory with the natural treasures lying beneath it. Because this vast eastern half does not just hold land. It holds resources of global scale, oil, gas, timber, rare minerals, and more. Yet in community after community, life feels poorer rather than richer. Understanding why such abundance hasn't translated into prosperity requires looking beyond demographics and geography. It turns attention instead to how resources are harvested and where their value actually goes. The resource paradox. At first sight, eastern Russia looks as if it ought to be booming. Hidden under its forests, tundra and mountains are some of the largest energy and mineral reserves on Earth. Oil, natural gas, coal, rare earths, diamonds, timber, gold. The list touches almost every resource the global economy depends on. The Sakha Republic, for example, contains the huge Tomta rare earth deposit often cited as one of the world's most significant future sources of rare metals. Norilsk is home to critical nickel and palladium production, responsible for roughly 40% of global palladium supply, and the Yamal Peninsula in northern Siberia ranks among the globe's richest gas provinces. Based on this scale, you might expect Siberia to resemble Alberta or Texas, dense energy corridors, booming towns, and strong infrastructure. Instead, the very wealth that should have built up the region remains strangely absent from the lives of most people living there. This is the essence of what is often called the resource paradox. The land generates immense value, but produces few lasting improvements for locals. In practice, a large share of Russia's federal budget continues to depend on oil and gas revenues drawn from Siberia and the Far East. Pipelines stretch thousands of kilometers from gas fields directly toward Europe or increasingly eastward into new supply contracts with China. The much-publicized power of Siberia pipeline illustrates this shift. Gas now flows toward Asia on long-term deals, though the commercial terms remain contested, with pricing debates still unresolved. Yet wherever the flows are directed, little of the wealth pauses in the towns around the extraction sites. Timber is felled and shipped abroad, metals are mined and exported, hydrocarbons pumped into pipelines and pushed out across borders, while the workers inside the region rely on unstable contracts, temporary housing, or rotational camps. In regional GDP terms, the gap is striking. Local economies of Siberia and the Far East consistently fall behind the national average, even though they generate the backbone of the export trade. Instead of steady urban growth, settlements empty out. In many places, the workforce arrives on flights or trains for shifts, then leaves quickly again. It is common for the infrastructure networks to prioritize moving resources efficiently outward, direct pipelines, dedicated rail lines, rather than building roads or services that link surrounding towns together. The pattern leaves behind communities with fading schools, declining hospitals, and deteriorating housing, even as multi-billion-dollar contracts are negotiated far away in Moscow or Beijing. The roots of this model stretch back to the Soviet era. From the start, the aim was never to root long-term populations in the frontier, but rather to extract strategic resources for the benefit of the industrial heartland. Projects were built under command-style priorities, often resembling military bases, strict, temporary, and narrowly focused on production. Workers were routinely rotated in and ordered out when projects ended. As long as the Soviet center directed subsidies, many such settlements survived. When the Soviet system collapsed in the 1990s, the economics of sustaining them collapsed as well. Many small industrial towns were simply abandoned. Those that endured did so only by tightening their focus on export markets, which reinforced the original extractive logic. Comparisons to other resource frontiers highlight the absence of reinvestment. Alberta in Canada, for instance, turned oil sands operations into permanent communities like Fort McMurray, with schools, shopping centers, and local tax revenues to fund services. Canadian provinces keep a share of resource revenue, enabling reinvestment that cushions downturns and sustains families. Siberia never experienced this cycle. Instead, regional leaders remain dependent on allocations from Moscow. Funds that do arrive often go into prestige projects or limited-use infrastructure rather than local institutions. This policy landscape weakens resilience and leaves smaller towns stuck on the edge of collapse. Automation and new industrial practices deepen the problem. Gas fields in places like Yamal can now operate with far smaller workforces thanks to advanced drilling and digital monitoring. Mining corporations bring in specialists for short rotations and take them out again, with little reason for them to establish roots. Entire operations run as isolated compounds, independent from nearby settlements, with their own energy and supply chains. This system creates extraction colonies rather than multi-generational communities. The paradox sharpens: ever more output, far less local benefit. The strategic mindset in Moscow reinforces the imbalance. Siberia is treated primarily as a storehouse of raw material, ensuring national independence and geopolitical leverage. Thus, projects that improve military security or secure long-distance pipeline links are prioritized. Investments into schools, housing, or local industries come secondary. As long as hydrocarbons and mineral products flow outward, the system is judged effective, even while local population levels slip year after year. This definition of success leaves many residents with little incentive to remain. Norilsk stands out as an example. Sitting above the Arctic Circle, it anchors the world's largest known nickel and palladium reserves, and the metals mined there are indispensable for electronics and green technologies. Yet residents live under some of the worst pollution conditions in Russia, with smog discoloring snow black and higher rates of health problems tied to emissions. Permafrost thaw has destabilized buildings across town. Despite generating vast sums in revenue, Norilsk itself has seen its population shrink, while profits flow mainly to company shareholders and state coffers. This single city illustrates the paradox in miniature, a hub of world-class resources that leaves behind a declining settlement. Similar dynamics repeat elsewhere. The Sakha Republic, with its huge Tomta rare earth deposit and extensive diamond fields, plays into global resource markets but sees villages lacking modern infrastructure. Sakhalin exports significant volumes of oil and gas, yet when companies cut staff, local employment shrinks and communities face crisis. Magadan, once a Soviet-era boomtown built on gold mining, has since the 1990s lost large portions of its population, leaving long avenues of deserted housing. Each case shows the pattern of exporting resource wealth while draining social vitality. On the ground, this paradox shapes everyday life. Workers may be picked up by corporate buses that shuttle them to closed compounds, where their food, energy, and medical services are handled separately from towns nearby. Local authorities often cannot demand reinvestment. Even while natural gas or oil operations build new terminals, families in surrounding areas decide whether to endure shrinking schools and limited services or to migrate westward for more secure opportunities. Increasingly, they choose departure, leaving behind aging parents, half-empty villages, and neglected apartments. By 2025, official figures make the paradox clear. Siberia and the Far East account for the great bulk of Russia's energy and resource exports, yet per capita GDP for these regions sits well below that of Moscow or St. Petersburg. Wealth appears in national budgets and company accounts, but not in the lives of ordinary residents. This is why Siberia provides one of the strongest living examples of the resource paradox: abundant reserves producing not prosperity, but persistent decline. Until the cycle of wealth outflow is reversed, reality east of the Urals will remain one of extraction without development. For many outsiders, the obvious explanation for why the East remains sparse is the environment itself. After all, when people hear Siberia, the first idea to surface is the climate. Blame it on the cold, not quite. Not everything about Siberia's emptying towns can be pinned on the thermometer. The bitter climate is real, but it is only part of the story. Blame it on the cold is a convenient narrative, and from the outside, it seems persuasive. Yet reducing the population decline of eastern Russia to winter weather alone misses the deeper drivers pushing people westward. Consider what day-to-day life looks like in some of the coldest regions. In places like Oymyakon, temperatures fall so low that diesel engines freeze solid and exposed skin can burn within minutes. Roads crack, pipes burst, concrete slabs split apart under cycles of thaw and refreeze. Winters are the longest season, and even the summer months bring relief only briefly, often replaced by thick clouds of mosquitoes. On the surface, it feels as if survival itself is a constant struggle. But these conditions cannot, by themselves, explain why towns vanish from Siberia's map when other regions in the Arctic hold stable populations. Northern comparisons prove how harsh climates can be managed. Across the Bering Strait, Alaska is not much warmer, yet the United States invested heavily to anchor settlements there. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline and the Alaska Highway linked remote communities to ports and markets, ensuring resource projects created permanent hubs rather than temporary camps. The result was towns that lasted, with stable populations supported by schools and hospitals. In northern Norway, settlements inside the Arctic Circle remain livable because government spending made roads, ferries, hospitals, and reliable internet cornerstones of daily life. Locals there speak about isolation but not abandonment, because state support offsets nature's severity. Even Canada's remote towns such as Yellowknife demonstrate the same principle. Cold itself does not dictate decline, policy does. Siberia's decline reflects the absence of sustained investment like this. The Soviet approach left a very different legacy. Many Siberian towns were designed to serve mines, gulags, or resource outposts, not long-term families. Infrastructure was minimal, and when central subsidies vanished, so too did the justification for residents to stay. A place built for extraction rather than for community cannot endure easily once the extraction slows. That pattern magnifies the impression that it is the snow itself driving people away, when in fact, the real culprit is decades of policy that treated the region as expendable. Indigenous peoples prove how resilience is possible even in brutal climates. Long before Russian expansion, groups such as the Evenki and Yakut sustained life by adapting to the tundra and taiga. They used resources carefully, herding reindeer, fishing, hunting, without exhausting the land. Their traditions worked with the rhythms of long winters, not against them. It was only after outside economic models imposed heavy industry and extraction that communities began eroding. Pollution and environmental damage piled onto the climate's challenges, creating conditions where traditional survival strategies no longer fit. The cold itself was never unbeatable. It became unbearable only when paired with mismanagement. Another overlooked factor is how Siberia is perceived inside Russia. Generations grew up viewing the region less as a frontier of opportunity than as a place of exile and punishment. For centuries, Siberia was synonymous with banishment, from Tsarist penal colonies to Soviet labor camps. Harsh winters reinforced the idea of Siberia as inhospitable, and the state never did much to overturn that narrative. Contrast this to Norway, where Arctic towns are celebrated as strongholds of national identity, or Alaska, where settlement was treated as a badge of pioneering resilience. Young graduates in Yakutsk or Khabarovsk often see relocation west as the only path to opportunity. This isn't just about weather, it's about how the state frames life in the cold. Climate also interacts with engineering realities in Siberia through permafrost. Buildings across the north stand on frozen ground, which historically provided a stable foundation. As the climate warms, that permafrost is thawing. In Norilsk, entire apartment blocks have developed tilting floors as the ground beneath them softens. Sewer systems and underground pipes fail when soil loses its rigidity, leaving residents without reliable water or waste removal. Retrofitting buildings or building new housing on thawing ground is often 30–40% more expensive than in stable soil. For residents, this means higher costs, fewer functioning services, and more reasons to leave. Siberia is now caught between the cold extremes of winter and the instability of summer thaw. The weather is also growing more destructive in ways unrelated to freezing temperatures. Summers bring massive wildfires to Siberia's forests, sometimes so widespread the smoke blankets entire cities and blocks out the sun for weeks. For those living in towns already struggling to keep hospitals or schools open, the added stress of fire damage deepens the sense that conditions are untenable. A brutal irony emerges. Summer creates crises now as much as winter ever did. Climate pressure is real, but it interacts with governance and infrastructure choices more than it dictates outcomes on its own. When you look at population patterns into the 2020s, the evidence is clear. If cold itself were decisive, advances in modern heating, logistics, and building design should have stabilized numbers. Instead, even where housing standards improved, decline persisted. Energy companies can maintain drilling rigs at -40 with imported technology, but families still choose to move away when their local schools shut down or clinics disappear. The cold may shape daily discomforts, but what convinces people to stay or go is whether support systems exist to make life viable. By 2025, describing Eastern Russia as too cold to live hides more than it reveals. Harsh weather amplifies challenges, but other polar regions show that investment, planning, and cultural framing make the difference between thriving Arctic towns and abandoned ones. For Siberia, the real explanation lies in how the state has historically invested or failed to invest in long-term infrastructure. The climate exposes weaknesses, but it does not alone create them. Which leads to the harder question: if it isn't simply the climate, what exactly has kept Siberia so disconnected and fragile? To see that, you have to shift from the air temperature to the map itself. Because what defines Eastern Russia most clearly is not the thermometer, but the absence of lines connecting one settlement to the next.